November 1881. The Wind River Range of the Wyoming Territory. That year, winter arrived with a brutal swiftness. The first heavy snow fell much earlier than expected. By the middle of October, settlers strung along the Popo-Agi River were already engaged in a desperate, frantic race against the approaching deep winter, splitting and stacking wood with feverish intensity. Every homesteader understood the essential calculus of survival, for cords of split wood were the absolute minimum necessary to see a family through a punishing Wyoming winter, 5 if the season proved particularly savage. Yet, beyond the sheer volume required, lay an insidious problem rarely discussed openly in town. This unseen enemy sabotaged efforts, extinguished warming fires, and often left families shivering in the cold darkness even when their stacks reached the rafters. You could spend hours splitting that firewood until your hands bled, stacking it neatly and tightly beneath every available overhang. But the mountains dealt in cycles, November rains turning to sleet, heavy snow piling 3 feet high, followed by a sudden thaw driven by a warm Chinook wind. And then February arrived, bringing that heavy, saturated snow that seeped right through tarps and canvas as if they offered no resistance. The result was inevitably wetwood, and wetwood doesn't burn. It merely smokes, hisses, and treacherously robs your home of heat rather than offering warmth. Most men resign themselves to this fate, accepting it as the inevitable price of winter in the mountains. Their solution was brute force: split more, burn more, and endure the suffering. But one man refused to accept this grim reality. His name was Everett Ashford. And in the autumn of 1881, he began excavating a large pit directly beneath his own house, a project that instantly convinced the entire valley he had utterly lost his sanity. Before we continue this remarkable story, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Every week on this channel, I deliver proven survival techniques pulled directly from the American frontier, strategies that were essential, not optional, for survival. Also, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Are you currently battling wet firewood, or do you have your own ingenious methods for keeping your stores dry? Now, let's look closely at what Everett constructed and the profound skepticism it provoked. Everett Ashford was neither a genius nor a formally trained engineer. He was a skilled carpenter from Pennsylvania who had moved west in '78 with his wife, Margaret, and their 2 young sons. He had built their robust cabin on a slight rise overlooking the river, complete with a sturdy foundation and a tightly fitted, chinked stone fireplace. By the rigorous standards of the frontier, it was a perfectly respectable home. Despite his skill, Everett faced a recurring, persistent issue every winter. His wood storage was chronically inadequate. Following local custom, he stacked his supply along the cabin's north side beneath a rudimentary, sloped lean-to, covered with weighted tarps. This arrangement sufficed during periods of dry, continuous cold. But Wyoming rarely offered such stable conditions. It specialized in relentless freeze-thaw cycles, chilling rain that turned instantly to ice, and snow that would melt under the afternoon sun only to refreeze solid at night, fusing the entire woodpile into one immovable, soggy, icy block. Consequently, Everett spent half his winter mornings struggling to pry frozen logs apart with a splitting maul, desperately searching for pieces dry enough to ignite. Even if he managed to start a fire, the wetwood would instantly smother it with billowing steam and thick, toxic creosote, clogging the chimney and filling the cabin with smoke that forced his family to breathe through painful coughs. The arithmetic was devastating. Wetwood burns at maybe 60% efficiency compared to dry. In practical terms, this meant he was consuming nearly twice the volume of wood just to maintain the bare minimum of heat. That summer of 1881, Everett settled on a radical solution that completely bewildered his neighbors. He planned to dig a root cellar, not for storing potatoes, but exclusively for firewood. Crucially, he wouldn't place it beside or behind the house, but directly beneath it. He envisioned a large, excavated chamber situated under the cabin's main room, accessible via a small trap door cut into the kitchen floor. A secondary, external entrance would be dug on the downhill side for efficient loading. This subterranean space, he reasoned, would remain perfectly dry, stable, and completely shielded from the weather. Gravity would naturally draw all moisture away from the structure, and the insulating earth itself would protect the wood from the damaging freeze-thaw cycles. To Everett, the logic was flawless. To everyone else, it sounded like sheer madness. "You're actually going to dig beneath your own foundation?" Jacob Pute, his nearest neighbor, demanded that July, watching Everett map the chamber's dimensions with string and stakes. "Not under the foundation," Everett calmly corrected him. "It's offset by 2 feet. The cellar walls will not make contact with the house supports." Jacob shook his head emphatically. "You're inviting a collapse, a flood, or likely both." Margaret Ashford, Everett's wife, remained silent, but he saw the deep concern mirrored in her eyes. Yet, she maintained her trust. After all, he had built the cabin impeccably the first time, and he'd proved his mastery over stone and timber when he repaired the cracked chimney. By late August, Everett was waist-deep in the soil beneath his cabin, relentlessly hauling out buckets of dense clay and rock. He shored the walls with split logs and laid a thick gravel bed across the floor for optimal drainage. The finished chamber measured approximately 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet high at its center, sufficient space to neatly stack and easily access 3 full cords of split firewood. The story of his subterranean excavation spread rapidly, and the consensus throughout the valley was absolute. Everett Ashford had definitively lost his wits. Let's now examine what Everett actually built, because the underlying engineering was far more intelligent than his neighbors realized. This underground woodshed was not merely a hole in the ground, it was a meticulously designed thermal and hydrological system based on 3 core principles: stable subsurface temperature, reliable gravity drainage, and carefully managed vapor pressure equilibrium. For the excavation itself, Everett dug about 5 feet below the cabin floor, setting the chamber base roughly 7 feet below the natural ground level on the uphill side. Critically, he selected a site where the natural terrain sloped away from the house, guaranteeing that any infiltrating moisture would be channeled downhill and away from the cabin structure. The chamber floor was not bare dirt. It was composed of a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel laid over tightly compacted clay. This engineering detail created an effective French drain system. Water could easily percolate downward through the gravel layer and move laterally toward the external entrance, where it discharged into a shallow ditch running safely away from the homestead. This guaranteed 0 standing water, no mud, and prevented any capillary action from drawing moisture back up into the stacked wood. The walls were constructed using dry-stacked field stone for the lower half, transitioning to horizontally laid split logs for the upper section, all packed tightly with clay and small stones for lateral stability. Everett intentionally left small, deliberate gaps, ventilation ports no wider than 2 inches, between these upper logs, positioned on opposite walls. This design allowed crucial air circulation to maintain dryness, without permitting rain or driven snow to enter the sheltered space. Now we reach the truly critical element, the connection to the cabin. Everett cut a 3-foot square trap door into the kitchen floor, positioned directly above the center of the wood storage. He reinforced the opening with double joists and fitted it with a hinged lid, which he lined with scrap fabric for added insulation. When sealed, the lid was nearly airtight. When opened, it allowed a ladder to be lowered, enabling someone to quickly descend and retrieve a load of firewood without ever having to venture outside into the brutal weather. But his innovation did not end there. On the downhill side of the chamber, he excavated a sloping tunnel, 4 feet high and just wide enough for a man to crouch walk through, emerging outside the cabin roughly 15 feet away. This served as the dedicated loading entrance. In the fall, Everett could process the wood in the yard, carry it straight through the tunnel, and stack it below ground without tracking mud or snow through his kitchen. A sturdy, low wooden door at the tunnel's mouth kept animals out and prevented large snowdrifts from blocking the passage. The entire system was strikingly elegant in its practical simplicity. Underground, the temperature stability is remarkable. Deep below the frost line, the soil maintains a consistent temperature, typically hovering between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the harshest winter. This temperature range is cold enough to inhibit rot and mold, yet warm enough to prevent the wood from freezing into that dreaded icy mass. Crucially, the subsurface humidity remains naturally low, provided there is adequate drainage and airflow. Wet firewood doesn't just absorb rain, it continually draws moisture from the ambient air, which is why wood stored in damp basements or covered outdoor piles eventually turns soggy. But in Everett's chamber, the gravel floor efficiently managed liquid water, the ventilation ports allowed water vapor to exit, and the earth walls acted as a vast sponge, absorbing residual ambient humidity. The net result was a perfectly engineered microclimate, keeping split wood bone dry even as the world above was saturated by melting snow. Everett completed the chamber in early September 1881. He spent the remainder of the month relentlessly splitting and stacking, and by the time the first hard frost arrived in October, he had stowed 2.5 cords of wood underground, accessible day or night, regardless of the weather. His neighbors observed him silently, shaking their heads in disbelief, and patiently awaited the inevitable failure. Daniel Calhoun was the undisputed authority on construction in the Wind River Valley. Having settled there since '74, he had built half the cabins along the Popo Agie and understood stone and timber with the certainty that some men hold for scripture. In late September, Calhoun made a point of visiting Everett's place to inspect the underground shelter. He stood at the mouth of the external tunnel entrance, arms tightly crossed and jaw set, maintaining a stone silence for a full minute before finally speaking. "Ashford, I've seen men try clever things before. Most of them end badly." Everett calmly wiped his hands on his trousers. "It's sound, Daniel. The drainage works. The walls are stable for now," Calhoun conceded. "Just wait until the spring melt. All that snowpack piled atop your house will turn to water, and water always finds the weakest point in the ground, which is going to be your hole." "What about the gravel bed?" Everett countered. "The gravel bed won't matter when you have 200 gallons an hour trying to force its way through frozen ground. It will pull. It will seep. And then your entire cellar will become a mud pit. You'll lose the wood, and if you're particularly unlucky, you'll lose the house when the ground shifts." Everett kept his tone level. "The slope carries it away. I've tested the runoff." Calhoun's expression was unmoved. "You tested it in summer. Not under 3 feet of snow, with the ground frozen solid, and melt happening faster than the soil can absorb it." The story of Everett's underground woodshed quickly solidified into a valley-wide running joke. Men at the trading post smirked when his name was mentioned. Women shook their heads pityingly, murmuring, "Poor Margaret, married to a man who digs graves beneath his own home." Jacob Pute delivered a blunt warning: "You are going to flood your foundation, Everett. And when that happens, don't come asking to borrow my timber to rebuild." Even Margaret's sister, visiting from Lander, cornered her one evening and whispered, "Is he well? I mean, mentally." Margaret offered no answer. She simply watched Everett that night, sitting quietly by the fire, sketching complicated drainage angles in his notebook by candlelight, and hoped with all her heart that he was right. This torrent of criticism was based on more than simple skepticism. It was rooted in generations of harsh frontier experience. These were men who had witnessed homesteads crumble over far less. A cracked foundation could be the fatal difference between a house that stood for 2 decades and one that collapsed into ruin in 5 years. Water was the relentless, foundational enemy of every structure on the frontier. And yet, here was Everett, intentionally carving a large void directly beneath his primary shelter, relying entirely on the soil not to betray him. Daniel Calhoun perfectly summed up the valley's sentiment outside the general store one cold afternoon in late October. "Ashford's gamble isn't about his firewood. It's about his family shelter. And that, he stated flatly, is not a wager a smart man makes." No one argued. Winter was fast approaching, and soon, everyone would know who was truly right. The initial snow of November 1881 was light, powdery, and easily gusted off the roofs, presenting no real challenge. Everett took this opportunity to split a few final cords, stacking them through the tunnel entrance until the underground chamber was nearly filled to the ceiling. By mid-November, his work was complete. 3 full cords of bone-dry wood sat waiting in the dark beneath his kitchen. Then December arrived. Temperatures plummeted instantly. By the second week, morning lows were consistently scraping 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The Popo Agie River froze first at the edges, then solid across its entire width. Snow fell relentlessly, 8 inches one night, 12 the next, followed by a brief, insidious thaw that transformed the accumulated snow into slush before the Arctic cold clamped down and locked everything into ice. This was the feared freeze-thaw cycle, the true bane of every homesteader. It commenced on December 18th when a warm, strong Chinook wind descended from the mountains, driving temperatures rapidly into the high 30s. The dry, powdery snow immediately turned wet and heavy, adhering to every surface. Roofs groaned audibly under the sudden weight, tarps sagged deeply, and every unprotected woodpile in the valley began soaking up water like a thirsty sponge. But by nightfall, the wind abruptly shifted. Arctic air roared back in, plunging temperatures to 15 degrees below zero. By the following morning, the saturated snow had frozen into concrete. Jacob Pute's woodpile, stacked under a flimsy canvas lean-to on his cabin's north side, had become a single, massive frozen block. He spent an agonizing hour wielding a maul and a pry bar just to fracture loose enough logs for his morning fire. Half of those logs were still too wet to catch, the others burned with a thick, choking smoke that drove his wife and children onto the porch, hacking and gasping, until the chimney finally cleared. Daniel Calhoun's wood fared marginally better. He had used heavily oiled canvas weighted down with stones, but even his supposedly driest pieces were unmistakably damp. He consumed an entire cord of wood in just 3 weeks, nearly double his normal burn rate, purely because wet wood cannot generate the thermal output of dry wood. This same grim scenario unfolded across the entire valley. Fires that should have easily lasted 6 hours died prematurely in 3. Chimneys choked on creosote. Men toiled to split frozen wood in the bitter cold, only to discover the interior of the logs saturated from months of exposure. Women struggled to boil water on stoves that barely held a flicker of flame, and children slept fully clothed because the homes simply could not retain enough warmth. Then came the ultimate trial. On January 9, 1882, a blizzard descended that would be recounted in the valley for the next 2 decades. It snowed without pause for 4 straight days. 36 inches fell in the first 72 hours alone. Snowdrifts piled 8 feet high against the north walls of cabins. The wind howled relentlessly, tearing tarps from wood piles, scattering kindling and burying everything beneath a suffocating blanket of white. When the storm finally exhausted itself, the temperature plunged to a catastrophic 22 degrees below zero. Desperate, people began burning their own furniture, tearing down fence rails, anything that might catch, because their dedicated firewood was either completely buried, hopelessly frozen, or saturated beyond use. Everett Ashford simply walked to his kitchen floor, opened the trapdoor, descended the ladder, and retrieved an armload of split pine. It was bone dry. The underground chamber had maintained a steady 48 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the ordeal. Not a flake of snow had entered, no pooled moisture had gathered. The strategically placed ventilation ports had ensured continuous air circulation without admitting precipitation, and the gravel floor had silently drained away even the trace condensation that formed where warm air met the cold earth. Everett lit his fire with a single match. It caught instantly, burned cleanly, and provided sustained, robust heat for 8 hours. Margaret stood near the stove, warming her hands. She said nothing, but she looked at her husband with an expression that bordered on awe. Outside, the valley was enduring misery. Inside, the Ashford home was comfortably warm, and the neighbors were certainly starting to take notice. If you're still with us, stay tuned, because what unfolded next didn't just vindicate Everett, it fundamentally changed how people constructed their homes in that valley for the next 50 years. Please hit the like button and leave a comment below telling me, what is the coldest winter you have ever endured? I'll see you in the next part. By late January 1882, the startling contrast was impossible to ignore. Jacob Pute had consumed 4.5 cords of wood in just 2 months. Daniel Calhoun was approaching 4 cords. Most families across the valley were desperately rationing their dwindling supplies, splitting sodden green wood and attempting to coax a flame using kindling and pitch-soaked rags. Everett Ashford? He had only burned 1¼ cords. Consider that ratio for a moment. The same valley, the same weather, and homes of comparable size. Yet, Everett was utilizing less than 1/3 of the firewood his skeptical neighbors were consuming. The explanation was straightforward: efficiency. Burning wet wood means you are not merely losing heat into the smoke, you are expending vast amounts of thermal energy simply to boil off the trapped moisture before the wood can even begin to combust. A piece of typical outdoor stacked firewood, often retaining around 25% moisture content, was sitting exposed to the elements after the December freeze-thaw cycles. That wood requires roughly 1,100 BTUs per pound just to vaporize and drive off the accumulated water. That's energy that should be warming your house and your family. But instead, it is simply disappearing up the chimney as useless steam. In contrast, Everett's wood, stored underground in a chamber with stable temperature and minimal humidity, averaged around 12% moisture content, a level considered nearly kiln-dry. When he fed a log into his stove, it caught fast, burned incredibly hot, and produced almost no creosote buildup. His chimney stayed remarkably clean. His fire radiated steady, even heat throughout the night. He could load the stove at bedtime and reliably wake up to coals still glowing red at dawn. His neighbors, on the other hand, were waking up to nothing but cold ash and the necessity of starting their fires over every single morning. The benefits extended beyond mere fuel savings. The interior temperature of the house was dramatically different. In early February, a traveling surveyor named William Hendricks stopped at both the Ashford and Butte cabins on the same afternoon. He carried a mercury thermometer, an expensive and reliable instrument at the time used primarily for weather observations, and he recorded the interior temperatures simply out of curiosity. Jacob Butte's cabin, with a roaring fire burning strong in a massive stone fireplace, registered 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Everett Ashford's cabin, with a moderate fire maintained in a similar fireplace, registered 68 degrees. That was a full 10 degrees warmer, achieved while using significantly less wood. Hendricks happened to mention the readings at the Trading Post a few days later, and the story spread like wildfire throughout the valley. 10 degrees might not sound like much, but it makes all the difference when you are forced to live in it. That is the crucial margin between sleeping under 2 blankets or 4, between heavy frost forming on the inside of your windows or the pane remaining perfectly clear, between your water bucket freezing solid overnight or staying pleasantly liquid. And here was the other unforeseen benefit nobody had anticipated. Everett's wood supply was still growing because the underground chamber stayed impeccably dry and stable regardless of the outside conditions. Everett could continue splitting and storing wood throughout the winter months. Most men couldn't accomplish that. Their outdoor piles were either frozen solid or buried deeply under layers of snow. But Everett could work on any mild day, easily split a half cord, and carry it through the tunnel into his storage area without ever worrying about it getting soaked in the next approaching storm. By March, when his neighbors were desperately scraping together the last remnants of their stockpiles and casting worried eyes at their fence posts, Everett still had a cord and a half resting safely underground, dry and ready for use. Daniel Calhoun would soon witness this advantage with his own eyes. He stopped by in late February, ostensibly to borrow a saw, but his true purpose was to see if the underground shelter had finally flooded during the spring melt. The temperature had climbed into the 40s for 3 straight days, and snow was melting everywhere, turning the ground into a soupy, muddy mess. Everett opened the trap door and cordially invited Calhoun to look down. The chamber was absolutely dry. The thick gravel floor had effectively absorbed and drained away the minor seepage. The stone walls were solid, and the woodpile looked as crisp and clean as if it had been stacked just yesterday. There was no mold, no rot, and no sign of moisture whatsoever. Calhoun stood there staring down into the subterranean chamber, and finally said the words Everett had been waiting months to hear. "I'll be damned." It wasn't an apology, but it was the profound acknowledgement Everett had been waiting months to hear. The math didn't lie. Everett's system worked, and it worked demonstrably better than anything else in the valley. Here's a clear breakdown, reconstructed from local records and surviving oral accounts. The average homestead consumed 2 cords of wood during the winter of 1881 to 82. Everett Ashford's consumption was only 0.75 cords, yielding an impressive wood savings of 64%. The average interior temperature during the February survey was 56 degrees to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Ashford's interior temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit, giving him a temperature advantage of 8 degrees to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. As for time spent retrieving firewood daily, outdoor piles demanded 15 to 25 minutes of hard work in harsh weather. Ashford's retrieval time was a mere 2 minutes, accessed conveniently via the indoor trapdoor, a convenience factor that was immeasurable but profoundly significant. And then, crucially, there was the spring melt test, the exact event Daniel Calhoun had warned would utterly destroy Everett's efforts. It didn't. The drainage system worked exactly as he had designed it. Snow melt percolated efficiently through the deep gravel bed, flowed downhill through the natural grade, and then exited cleanly through the shallow ditch Everett had meticulously dug the previous summer. There was no flooding, no foundation shift, and absolutely no structural damage. The underground wood shelter had survived its first winter, and it had done more than just survive. It had conclusively proven that sometimes the crazy idea is simply an idea nobody else had the courage or foresight to try. Spring 1882 immediately brought the questions. Men started showing up at Everett's door, asking for a look at the underground chamber. This time, they weren't coming to criticize, they were there to learn. Jacob Pute was the first. He walked over one mild April morning, hat in hand, and said, "Everett, I'd like to see how you built that tunnel entrance, the one that somehow doesn't let the snow in." Everett showed him the layout, patiently explaining the slope, the low door, and the strategic way he'd angled the opening to face southeast, ensuring that drifting snow would pass over it rather than pile up against it. By June, Pute was busily digging his own chamber. It was smaller than Everett's, measuring about 6 by 10 feet, but it was built faithfully on the same foundational principles: a gravel floor, strategically placed ventilation ports, effective downhill drainage, a convenient trap door leading into his kitchen, and an external loading entrance. Daniel Calhoun held out longer, perhaps due to pride or simply stubbornness. But by the fall of 1882, even he was asking Everett for detailed advice on foundation offsets and moisture barriers. Within 3 years, 17 homesteads within 50 miles of the Popo-Agi River had incorporated some version of Everett's design into their structures. Not all of these versions were identical. Some men built simpler iterations, essentially just external root cellars with exceptional drainage and ventilation, positioned intentionally close to the house. Others went all in, excavating full underground chambers complete with interior access. A few shrewdly combined the concept with root vegetable storage, creating dual-purpose cellars that kept both firewood and food reliably dry throughout the winter. But the fundamental principle spread rapidly because it worked, and it continued to work flawlessly. By the 1890s, the Ashford method, although nobody officially called it that, had become standard practice for homesteaders in high-elevation freeze-thaw regions across Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. You can still find remnants of these underground wood shelters today if you know precisely where to look: collapsed stone walls, overgrown tunnel entrances, and gravel beds that stubbornly refuse to grow anything because the drainage remains exceptionally good, even after 140 years of neglect. The technique didn't just save wood, it fundamentally saved lives. Families who kept their firewood dry had demonstrably fewer respiratory illnesses stemming from smoke inhalation. They burned fewer green logs, which naturally meant less creosote buildup, which in turn meant fewer catastrophic chimney fires. Their homes stayed significantly warmer, translating to fewer cases of frostbite and hypothermia during the brutal cold snaps. Children slept better. Wives didn't spend half the winter miserably coughing. And men didn't exhaust themselves every morning prying apart frozen, impossible wood piles. And here is the deeper lesson, the one that remains relevant whether you are living in 1882 or 2024. The best survival solutions are not always the loudest or the most immediately popular. Everett Ashford didn't invent underground storage. People have been utilizing root cellars for centuries. But he applied an old, proven principle to a new, critical problem. And he possessed the courage and tenacity to do it even when the so-called experts and his neighbors told him he was utterly wrong. He didn't argue with them. He didn't waste valuable energy defending his unconventional idea. He simply built it, tested it rigorously, and let the undeniable results speak for themselves. That is the frontier way. And that is the essential lesson we have largely forgotten in a modern world where everyone has a strong opinion, but far fewer people are willing to put their hands in the dirt and actually prove their theories. Before I wrap this up, if this story taught you something new, if it made you think differently about how our ancestors solved problems with nothing but stone, timber, and common sense, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you real techniques from the American frontier, techniques that worked when there was no backup plan, no hardware store just down the road, and no rescue party coming. And please drop a comment below. What part of the system would you use today if you were building off-grid? The underground access, the gravity drainage, the stable temperature zone? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to hear from you. Now, one last important educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters' names and specific events mentioned are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are grounded in real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be thoroughly evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and all applicable laws or regulations. This content is purely educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.